what we will be discussing in our next panel about global expansion strategies and challenges. So, I would like to welcome to my stage two amazing gentlemen, Mr. Stefan Ross, GTM Builder and Advisor, and Mr. Akis Bratsos, Partner at Lakestar. A big applause, everybody.
So it's great to be here. How's your singing, Stefan?
My singing?
Yes.
Well, I mean, I feel
we just had a panel about the Eurovision, man.
Yeah, well, I mean, it looks like there's less people here than in the last session, so maybe... no, I think my singing is questionable. My one-year-old loves my singing, but I'm still figuring out why everyone else hates it, so we'll see. Well, how about yours?
Nobody likes my singing, man. I don't have kids yet, so no one wants to listen to me sing. So we're going to talk about international expansion. We're going to talk about what it takes to create a big company from zero all the way to hundreds of millions. I'm very pleased to have Stefan here with me. Stefan was an early employee at Celonis and at Pigment. He scaled those businesses to billions in valuation. I'm one of the partners at Lakestar in London. Lakestar is a pan-European $3 billion fund. We were early investors and on the boards of companies like Spotify, like Revolut, like Klarna and blockchain. And my first question that I want to ask you is, when it comes to creating a scalable, global go-to-market business, if you think about this from a first principle standpoint, what are some of the primitives that come into it? How do you design a scalable sales engine so that companies like Celonis and Pigment can scale quickly and grow within different markets?
So just generally building for scale. Well, I think, especially with VC-backed tech companies, I think the mantra is everyone wants to build for scale. But in order to do so, we need to build a repeatable engine. In order to have a repeatable engine, we have to have measurable, defined, proven success points in your go-to-market. It's also worth acknowledging that yes, there's market forces, there's tailwinds, there's headwinds, but the most important thing is having go-to-market discipline. And what we mean by that is following best practices. For example, if in B2B, looking at where we source business from. Is it from partners? Is it from inbound? Is it from outbound? And not creating dependency on single channel. It's having clear and strict definition on ICP, but then not allowing that to be rigid and have it evolve with market conditions. It's having strict qualification criteria with how I measure the types of clients that we want to work with and how we define return on investment for each of those clients. And I think that one of the challenges you have with these market tailwinds, and we've seen that recently from COVID, and we see this obviously a lot of hype right now around language models and artificial intelligence, that tailwinds often create risk as well. And I think that we've both seen where tailwinds can lead to single point of dependency on inbound opportunities. They can often mean that people deprioritize the return on investment story because they think that tailwind will continue. And so independent of the market forces, it's really important to just continue with the go-to-market discipline that will ultimately achieve your scale. But I mean, I'd be remiss not to ask, given that you're working for a pan-European fund here, is that how do you look at tailwinds, headwinds, market forces when you're making investment decisions? Right now I see people plowing, say, investment capital into artificial intelligence. In 2019, it was in ESG-related solutions. How does that influence your decision-making on deploying capital?
Look, I think price in the short term usually is decoupled from the ultimate value of the company, right? So in the short run, price oscillates up and down. We try not to focus too much on that. We try to focus on the underlying tailwinds of the market. We try to look at what are some of the fundamentals. And usually we look at 4 or 5 different things, right? So we start from looking at the team, the product, the technology, the financials, the business plan, and the underlying potential of all of those together to build a generational company. So in the short run, I try not to spend too much time looking at what others are doing or what the market is doing in general. We try to inform our views by being more thematic. So within the firm, we have 4 areas that we spend time on. We look at fintech, healthcare, deep tech, and applied AI. I lead our applied AI thesis for the past 7 years, and I try to focus just on that. So if you ask me a question around fintech, I don't really know a lot, right? But I try to focus much more on the things that I know. The other thing is per partner, we do around the on investment per year. So we care much more about the things that we do versus the things that we don't do. So I do not care that much if the market is moving away from me in some kind of dimension that I haven't spent time on. I try to focus much more on the things that I've done the work, and I try to focus on them by meeting people over time. I think one of the advantages that we have as investors is we have the ability to meet with entrepreneurs over a well-defined interval of time. So I don't have to invest in the first meeting. I can invest if I know people after 2 or 3, 4 years. And that's a significant advantage that we have and over founders and over others because we have more data and we have more information and we try to map that into our benchmarks and into the way that we look at the world and also we can update our thesis over time. I think this is an interesting segue into how you think about when is the right time to expand internationally, because at the end of the day, it's very rare that you can build a big generational company within a single country. It has happened before. We have seen some companies who have become very big. But historically, you do need to start somewhere and then enter a new market over time if you want to generate hundreds of millions of revenue. So from your experience, what have been some of the key requirements for people to do this, and what are some of the signals that you're ready to do that?
You know, it's a good question. It's a loaded question. I think people's favorite answer, it depends. It really does. It depends. Because it depends on your value proposition and the ICP that you're servicing. So some companies in very specific verticals might only be able to service a particular geography. So if your value proposition is more agnostic to geography, and it depends where you're starting. So if you're starting here in Greece versus the United States, as an example, you will have completely different timings with when you want to go internationally. But the principles still remain the same, which is, again, having measurable proof points that I've defined my product market fit, I've proven the ICP, and that I have that value proposition being proven with return on investment and success stories with domestic clients. I think that until you have this a repeatable engine in knowing how to generate business, whether that's through inbound channels or outbound channels, whether it's through partners, you can't then de-risk going internationally. I think the way I tend to look at it is that once you have those proof points in your domestic market, it's about how do I seed your next geography, and also I want to be in a place where it has sufficient market potential that I'm not having to, I mean, if you're in Greece and you want to move internationally, it would make sense to move into a larger geography that you're not having to then move into another international market so quickly. So, for example, when I think about some of these proof points, let's say you're moving into Germany, you might say, well, let's look at indirect partner go-to-market. Let's look at partners that are in territory, in market, before me actually deploying capital and deploying resource domestically. If you're in, say, software business, your biggest overhead are people. So before you want to go and hire 5, 10 people in a particular geography, how can I, from my domestic market, obtain those success stories to then seed the market, which will make it much easier to then move in? So it's not, it does depend, but for me, the very least, you can't consider the expansion until you have proven potential in whichever domestic market that you're engaged in.
Makes sense.
Does that make sense?
Makes sense. And I have a follow-up question. Are there certain ways of selling and expanding across Europe that are better suited for the European market, compared perhaps to the US market or perhaps to other markets? Are there certain areas where, at Celonis or other companies that you've seen or advised have done in a very good way, for example, to enter Germany or France or Italy?
Yeah, it is definitely different. I mean, if you're looking to sell into Europe, like we can't avoid the fact that there are, in Europe, 45 countries, in the EU, there's about half of that, and each have their own sense of sovereignty when it comes to regulation, when it comes to culture, when it comes to language. These are things that you can't necessarily escape. Now, when you're going to, say, the United States, it's easier as a single market with a single language with less regulatory differences from state on state. So typically you can look at the geography as being the northeast, the south, the Midwest, and the West. And in Europe, you're doing that more from a country perspective. And I think that with the difference in consideration are what do I need to be repeatable from a product standpoint. So let's say, do you have language considerations in your product, if that's what you're selling? Do you have to have regulatory considerations if you're selling into the EU? And then within the EU, the difference between Germany and France. And also, for example, your sales cycle, how does that change? For example, in Germany, we see the strength of workers' councils in businesses. So that's an extra consideration when you're selling. So that maybe not isn't the case in the UK, or if you're going to the US. So definitely having an understanding of what are the repeatable engines. That's why it's so important. Let's say you are in Greece, we're here today, that when you're looking at that next market, that the market's sufficiently large enough that it can merit the investment into the repeatable processes to be able to sell. And that's why typically why people are drawn to the US, because the ease of that single market. And it's also why it's the important of the I guess the shifting momentum towards EU.Inc. and the ease of doing business within Europe as a singular market. But I guess from an investment perspective, this is where I guess I have curiosity towards you, is that we see the traditional hubs in London and in Paris and in Berlin and in Munich, and you're a pan-European fund. What's your perception on the different geographies and where you're deploying capital, and the difference of someone building out in the Balkans versus the UK?
So when we were started, around 15 years ago, we were started with two beliefs. One is that great teams and great companies can come from anywhere. And the second was that Europe is making it a lot more difficult for founders to build a great company. Europe is inherently decentralized. We have this concept of the European Union, but it's not very united, right? There's localization challenges. If you start from Greece or you start from the UK to enter Germany, and I'm not just talking about the language itself, the institutional framework across all of those different countries is different. So the way we look at this and the way we try to do this is in a number of ways. So one is on a bottoms-up kind of standpoint, we try to have presence. So we try to be there. So we have an office in the UK, we have an office in Berlin, we have an office in Zurich, and we travel all the time, right? So we try to be in most of the major ecosystems, but also to some of the ones that are emerging in order to actually help them get there. The other thing that we do a lot, we spend a lot of time at universities. Technological IP starts there. So we're very close with the University of Oxford in the UK, with ETH in Zurich, and a few others. And we go there a few times during the year to talk to students and to others to educate them that they don't actually have to work at Goldman or at McKinsey, at one of those businesses. They can actually start a company. They can take on that risk. The last thing is, usually what we found is this is also not enough, however, so we try to do things top down. Our founder and one of our partners, he's the chairman of the fund that is deploying capital through NATO. We're very close with the various European governments. We have some people from former prime ministers in our board. And whenever our companies need to enter European geographies, we make sure that we can leverage that network so that they can have an advantage. This was quite instrumental, for example, in the fight of Spotify with Apple in 2014, when they were kicked out of the App Store, with Revolut, when they got the UK banking license. And through those measures, we try to be influential. I would kind of clarify and qualify everything that I said by, obviously an ecosystem in Eastern Europe like Greece and others are behind the one in the UK, and that's because usually it takes time to build a diverse network of entrepreneurs or companies that are successful. It requires one or two success stories to pave the way for the others to come. So since we invested in Revolut, we've invested in 5 or 6 teams that come from Revolut, operators who were there early and now are building their own companies. Usually that fuels the growth of the ecosystem because others see that they can create wealth for themselves and for the economy through non-traditional means. And culturally, this is the biggest barrier. People talked about this yesterday in a few of the panels, and I think this is important. But I think it's changing. And I think this is where I wanted to ask you. Ultimately, the value of, and we're very fortunate to have you as one of our advisors, I would love for you to talk a bit about some of the case studies within Celonis and Pigment and in other companies that you've seen on how these companies have done it well. What were some of the best practices that you saw there? Because I feel like as an operator, but also as an investor, you learn a lot more if you win, if you do well. Because usually if you lose, there's a number of things that go badly for you and your company. Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I actually have one follow-up to what you were saying, because it influences my comment as well. Is, I'm half Scottish, half Serbian, and I think one of the challenges, and I think it's changing, because we talk about kind of international ambition, is that I think that there's a prevailing narrative that in order to build a truly global organization or to have truly global market adoption, I need to be in one of those traditional hubs, like in London, like in Berlin or New York. I need to shift. And I think that often when I'm speaking to, let's call it
let's call it emerging or non-core markets, like in Scotland or like in the Balkans. And I often feel that the founders are looking at domestic issues, or they're looking at maybe just short or they're looking at solving pains and challenges that maybe only service the Balkans, because they don't feel that they can actually address global challenges. Is that something that you see, and do you see that as a shifting narrative? Because it actually touches on where I see successes from Celonis and Pigment.
I think it's shifting. We've done a number of new investments in Eastern Europe. One of the when I was hired to help set up our London office, but also help set up our Eastern European presence. So we've done a lot more in Eastern Europe. I'm very keen to do a new investment in Greece if I can, if we manage to do that. I see a lot more of my peers in other funds visit the country. Even in this conference, which is the first time that they actually do this conference, I see a lot of international funds, and that's great. Historically, Greece and Eastern Europe in general has had the advantage of amazing people who maybe they're not present in the country, but they went outside and they're studying and maybe they're building businesses, and this has been a source of wealth, right, and ways to invest in the country. I think it's changing. I think it takes time. I don't think it's straightforward. I think it needs a lot of time for the culture to set and to accept that there's other ways of actually to live your life.
I think we need those success stories, those proof points, to people to break the mold. And kind of tying that back to Celonis and Pigment is good, just examples of recent successes of technology companies in Europe. I think they're very different in what they were trying to service. So if you look at Celonis, it was actually building an entirely new category of software that never existed before, which was process mining. And so the challenge they had was, okay, I have to educate an entire market on what our technology does and build it from scratch. And there was and there's pros and cons. I mean, the opportunity is that you don't have competition. There's no such competition for a market that doesn't exist. But the challenge is you have to educate buyers on a budget that they would have never allocated for technology they never knew existed. So it is fundamentally difficult. And then you look at Pigment joining a space like EPM, which is one of the oldest kind of software spaces, 25, 30 years old. And it was a case of, well, how do I displace existing vendors, as an example, and take it with a novel approach? And I think that has, again, its own challenges. It's hugely dense with competition, but then it's already the path for success, the path for sales, the path for how you sell, and the buyers are very educated. So you're actually creating you're piggybacking on existing foundations being laid. I think when I look at, they're very different in what they were doing, but the similarities are they were obsessively global in their ambition. I think that they were always thinking, instead of thinking about the bigger pains, the bigger problems, they were obsessed about a focused ICP, but not rigid. And what I mean by that is, for example, Celonis was selling like accounts payable, accounts receivable, purchase to pay, kind of financial processes, but they were process agnostic. But during COVID, we pivoted to supply chain focus. So the persona that we were selling to was slightly different. And we were doing that from an informed market position. So it's being exceptionally focused on who we sell to. And then the most important thing across both is they were also hugely obsessed with ensuring clients are successful. And it sounds really obvious, but the reality is that the amount of times I'm seeing where, for example, we're trying to maximize revenue at the expense of getting the right story with the right client and the right customer. And it's about creating that momentum in the market. And I think at the early stages, Celonis and Pigment, what they did is they wanted to harness stories with the relevant ICP, and they would bend over backwards to get those stories and make those clients successful. And those are the kind of rock solid foundations. And that's why churn rates for them were exceptionally low. I mean, the gross retention was 95+%, which is maybe best in class. But it was from a foundation of obsession on customer value. And then actually kind of tying it back to yourself is that you're pan-European, but you focus on seed to Series C. And I've been also seed to pre-IPO. When you look as an investor's perspective across all these portfolio companies, what do you see as the primary pitfalls or the challenges, and at what stage from seed to Series C are you seeing that?
I think the biggest one is it's very different to build a company from seed to Series A to B and to C. You need to transform the business. 60% of companies from seed to Series A never raise any subsequent funding. Around 50% never raise a Series B. So if you manage to get all the way to Series C, you're the top 15-20% of companies of all time, right? So at that moment, you basically have a lot more options. So if you unpack that and you try to look at why that is, the biggest determinant of success is how you construct your team. Usually the people that are very strong and very good for you, when you get to 1 or 2 million of revenues, are not the same ones that are going to take you from 2 to 20 and 20 to 200. And that also goes for the founders themselves, right? You need to be able to complement your team in a way where they cover your blind spots in a way. They have the ability to see where some of the areas of weakness so that they can actually lift the entire company up. So I think that's the first thing. There's an exogenous thing which is capital formation, and it is obviously highly cyclical and it oscillates, but it does matter. So if you started a company in 2021, you would be greatly disadvantaged because capital markets were shut, right? If you were starting a company today, you're on the other end of the spectrum because there's over $500 billion of dry powder and investors that are waiting on the sidelines to deploy that capital, right? So it's a much better time to build a business today compared to a few years ago, and it was much better compared to 10 years ago. And I think that makes a fundamental difference in the way you look at things. The other things that I would say is, and it ties back to the first and second point, frankly, and I think it brings everything together, is operationally how you create a company. It's a way of systematically thinking about how you link the team that you have for the product that you're building, the way you're selling it, and the way you're creating a business plan. And these are 4 things together that have to be in sync, and that's very difficult. And usually they change across stages. In the beginning, if your goal is to get to a place of product market fit, as we call it, like to just be able to say, okay, the market wants my product. But that doesn't mean that you're actually ready to scale, right? There's a lot of different ways of taking that, and you talked a lot about this. You can do inbound marketing, you can do sales-led growth, product-led growth, you can do all sorts of different things. But the way this ties to everything that you've done up until this point might not be homogeneous. And that's the challenge that I see.
It's interesting because it's literally why we built the company we did now, which is supporting these portfolio companies, these VC-backed high-growth companies, bridge that gap from seed to Series A. Yes, it's about the product market fit. It's actually about, when I talk about that scalable, repeatable, measurable, is focusing on that measurable, proven, metric-driven performance. Because how do you know at the point I need to create repeatable processes? And typically, that's where you get your Series A funding. And I imagine that that's what you're looking at. You're looking at that product market fit, and you're looking at, do you have an engine which can be created to be repeatable? And that Series A is a bit of a chasm, I think, often we see between seed and Series A, but also A and B, right? Because it's those companies that are able to produce those repeatable engines. And it's, well, okay, well, can I build a repeatable inbound channel? Can I a repeatable outbound channel? Can I actually grow my sales organization without creating bloat? And I think that you're spot on, as these challenges kind of evolve and change. And it's interesting to see it consistently from the investor perspective, but also as an operator as well.
Well, I think we're out of time.
Actually, yeah.
But this was fun.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming to Greece. It's actually my first conference in Greece, so I'm glad that we did it together.
Me too.
I hope everyone enjoyed it. We're going to be here after this.
Yeah. Thank you very much, man.